Ever feel like you got the wrong instruction manual for this whole adulting thing?
Right.
Everyone else seems to just glide through, like job interviews are a breeze and fitting in is effortless, but you're stuck wrestling with these same old insecurities.
It's like those echoes of past hurts, they just make it so much harder to move forward.
Exactly. And it feels like those feelings of not belonging,
Yeah.
especially when they're tied to things that have happened to us, well, sometimes the usual advice just doesn't cut it.
Right. It's not always about getting better at communicating or mastering mindfulness. Sometimes it's about digging deeper and figuring out why connecting with others feels like this uphill battle.
And that's what really struck me about this piece we're diving into today, understanding disconnection in adulthood. It really gets into how past trauma can build this invisible wall that keeps us from belonging even when we crave it so much.
Absolutely. And the article kicks off with a story that I think a lot of us can relate to, about this woman, Mia, who just can't seem to catch a break when it comes to finding a job.
Oh, I remember Mia's story. It's like rejection after rejection. You could just feel the weight of it all piling up on her.
And I think it's important to point out, while job hunting is tough for almost everyone, for someone like Mia, each no might be bringing back all these old feelings of not being good enough, shaking her whole sense of self-worth.
Yeah, it's more than just wanting a paycheck, right? It's this deeper fear of not measuring up.
Exactly. So, to try and deal with all this emotional turmoil, Mia reaches out to her friend Rachel for support. Rachel, who obviously means well, suggests going for a run to clear her head.
Ah, the classic advice.
Yeah, and while exercise can be a great way to blow off steam, the article makes this interesting point that, in this case, the advice, while well-intentioned, kind of misses the mark.
It's like telling someone with a broken leg, just walk it off. It's a perfect example of how even the people closest to us might not truly get how deep those struggles go, especially when past trauma is involved.
Yeah. Right. And that brings us to the first big lesson the article digs into, learning how to deal with rejection in a way that doesn't send us into a tailspin. It's about recognizing that for a lot of people, rejection isn't just a one-time thing. It can dredge up old wounds and make us relive past hurts in the present.
It's like this vicious cycle. Every no just reinforces those negative tapes playing in our heads.
Exactly. And the article really emphasizes that for people carrying the weight of past trauma, rejection can be especially triggering. It can make them question their worth and amplify those feelings of being different or even fundamentally flawed. So the trick isn't becoming immune to rejection, because really, who is, right? It's more about figuring out how to handle it without letting it completely derail our sense of self.
That's where that whole rejection isn't personal thing comes in, yeah. I gotta say, that's always been a tough one for me to wrap my head around. Like, how can we not take it personally when it cuts so deep, you know?
Yeah. The article actually brings up a really interesting point about that. It talks about how, for someone like Mia, who might be carrying all this baggage from past trauma, rejection can feel like proof that their worst fears are true. It can bring back feelings of abandonment or make them think they're just inherently unlovable or unworthy.
Wow, that really puts things into perspective. Like, those old wounds are being ripped open again, and it's gotta be almost impossible to see things clearly in those moments.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to remember that in most cases, rejection isn't actually about us as individuals. The article even uses this example of like, even the most successful people out there, they all face criticism and disapproval. Think about any artist who broke the mold or a musician who totally changed the game. They've all got their haters.
So it's more about separating our past experiences from what's happening right now, almost building a wall to stop those old wounds from dictating how we react.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's about understanding that our past, while it's part of who we are, doesn't have to define our present or our future. Which is, easier said than done, of course. But the article stresses that this whole shift in thinking, it's definitely doable with a little time and some self-compassion.
And that kind of brings us back to self-care, which is what we were talking about before, often gets oversimplified. Like it's not just bubble baths and face masks, especially when we're dealing with heavier stuff like past trauma.
Oh, absolutely. When it comes to feeling like an outsider, the article actually challenges us to see self-care as an act of courage. It's about consciously creating a space where we can face those tough emotions that come up from rejection head on, not just trying to outrun them or slap a band-aid on them.
So in Mia's case, going for a run, it might give her a temporary break from those feelings, but it doesn't really get to the root of the problem. It's not really self-care in the sense of healing and moving forward.
You hit the nail on the head. The article suggests that real self-care, especially for people dealing with past trauma, might involve things like therapy, or finding healthy coping mechanisms, or even just giving ourselves the permission to feel our feelings without judgment.
It's about accepting that healing takes time and that we need to be gentle with ourselves, which honestly can be a really tall order in a world that's all about instant gratification.
You said it. And this leads to another super important point the article brings up. The line between success and failure, it's often way more blurry than we think, especially for people who feel like they're always on the outside looking in.
Okay, now you've got me really intrigued. Tell me more about this blurry line.
We're constantly bombarded with this idea that success is this straight shot, this destination we'll reach if we just tick off all the right boxes. But what the article points out is that this way of thinking can be pretty damaging, especially for people who are already struggling with feeling like they don't belong.
It's like we're holding ourselves up to this impossible standard, which just sets us up to feel like we're constantly failing.
Exactly. And for someone in Mia's shoes who might already be dealing with the fallout of past trauma, every single perceived failure just adds fuel to that fire of not being good enough, of not belonging.
So how do we break free from this cycle of always chasing after this elusive definition of success, especially when it feels like it's so deeply embedded in everything around us? So how do we break free from this cycle of always chasing after this elusive definition of success, especially when it feels like it's so deeply embedded in everything around us?
Well, the article actually offers a really refreshing take on this, and it comes from a kind of surprising place, an ant colony.
Okay, now I'm really interested. How can ants teach us anything about being human, especially when we feel like we're on the outside looking in?
It's about shifting our perspective, from focusing on what we achieve as individuals to recognizing the power of diverse contributions. In an ant colony, each ant has its own specific role to play, right? But none of those roles are seen as more or less important than the others. It's the collective effort, the fact that every ant brings something unique to the table that allows the colony to survive and thrive.
So it's not comparing ourselves to others or trying to be the queen ant or whatever. It's about understanding that our own individual strengths, even the ones that come from the challenges we've faced, they all have a place and a purpose.
Exactly. And the article highlights how perfectly this applies to our own human experiences, especially for those of us who've always felt like we don't quite fit in. It's about learning to see our perceived flaws or differences as strengths that, when we embrace them, can lead to a sense of belonging we might not have thought possible.
That makes me think about Mia again. Instead of seeing all those job rejections as personal failures, what if she started to view them as opportunities, chances to figure out what really matters to her and find a place where her unique experiences are valued, not judged?
I love that reframing. The article really drives home the point that true belonging isn't about forcing ourselves to fit in or conform to what society expects. It's about finding where our authentic selves can flourish, where our individual contributions are celebrated.
This has been such an insightful conversation, a real deep dive into what it means to navigate adulthood when those old wounds of not belonging run so deep. Before we wrap up, is there one big takeaway from understanding disconnection in adulthood that we can leave our listeners with?
The article ends with this really powerful question, and I think it can be such a guiding light for anyone who's struggling with these feelings of being an outsider. It asks, how can you embrace your own unique strengths and use them to navigate the challenges of adulthood, especially when those old feelings of not belonging come creeping back in? And I think it's a beautiful reminder that true belonging starts with self-acceptance, with recognizing that our differences aren't weaknesses, they're the keys to unlocking a deeper sense of purpose and connection.
Such an important message. And to all our listeners out there, as you navigate the ups and downs of being an adult, remember, you are not alone in feeling like you don't belong. Embrace your journey, honor your past, and trust that your unique strengths have the power to create a future filled with genuine connection and belonging.